But now the other influence on Edenton, if you go out here to the center and turn left, you go 75 miles, you come to the Outer Banks and access to the ocean. And for the sailing ships, anytime they could get this far inland with their goods still on the water, that was very profitable for everybody involved. Well, that put Edenton on the maritime map, and it was such a busy port of call, we had to have 2 customs houses, one on each side of town to collect all the revenue for the king. And that's why Edenton became the very first capital of the colony right through the Revolution, and very first capital of the state of North Carolina. And, well, you had all the king's representatives living here looking out for his interests, but you also had all the local politicians living here looking out for the colony's interests. And a number of our residents became very well known for what the king considered treasonous activities during the Revolutionary period. And this became the hotbed of all that political activity. Very dynamic. And a number of our fellows, like I say, became very well known for their activities. Now, straight ahead of us, that very Monet-looking bridge, that's Queen Anne's Creek. And everything you can see the car going across the bridge. Well, everything to the right of that creek, going all the way out to the point, and around this point to the next one, that's all Hayes Plantation. It's one of the few plantations in the region you can't visit because it's still privately owned and operated as a full working plantation.
Is it owned by the same family?
No, second family. Well, we never had a family by the name of Hayes to begin with. It was a land grant to Sir Walter Raleigh of 5,000 acres, which he never visited. He had so many land grants, he was very popular with the king. But he applied the name Hayes. We think his wife was a little homesick, so he named it Hayes after the homestead that she'd grown up in back in England. Don't know if it cured the homesickness, but the name stuck. And one of our patriots, Samuel Johnston, acquired the property in 1701, and it was he and his son that stood it up as a working plantation. Can't see it from down here, but up behind the trees is the old homestead from 1730, and it was in the Johnston family for 186 years, and it was being passed through the generations, eldest son to eldest son. Well, in 1886 they ran into a bachelor, and he felt he needed to explain himself, so he wrote a letter that accompanied his will, and he said in the letter, he said, being a bachelor, I have no direct heirs to leave my properties to. I do have a couple of second cousins that probably qualify. They're incompetent. And yeah, I got a couple myself. I felt his pain. Well, he left it to his best friend, a man named Wood, and it's in the Wood family to this day, and they still occupy the 1730s homestead. They don't do the farming, they lease it out to commercial guys, and it's down to about 1,200 acres. But they grow everything. It all depends on what they're speculating the cash crop of the year to be, but it's everything from cotton, tobacco, soybeans, some peanuts, sage, sorghum, which is a sugar kind of plant. But yeah, still very active.
So is that house on the point part of the Hayes property?
Well, it was at one time. Back in the 1990s, you noticed the power lines. They sold all the waterfront from the power lines out to the shore to a developer, and there are 36 of those very exclusive waterfront homes out there.
How do you get to them?
That's how that bridge come about.
Oh, okay.
And if you go over there...
So do you have to go through the plantation to get
yes.
to the homes?
Mm-hmm. Very pleasant out there. Well, that's how that bridge came about, was prior to the bridge, all the residents were having to drive way out into the county to get back into town to do their errands. And they put that bridge in and made a great shortcut for them to get into town. But, well, if you go over there, yeah, you go over there, there's a sign that says private gated community. And a friend of ours out there, she told me, she said, tell your guests, if the gate's open, feel free to go out and do windshield tour or hike it or bike it. She said, what happened was a great shortcut to get into town, but they put in the gate because the local boys figured out that was a great shortcut to get across the plantation to the country club on the other side and all their golfing tea times. And so they had all this unnecessary traffic zipping through on the weekends when the kids are home. And so they were zipping through the neighborhood. So like I say, if you want to go out and see the old homestead, there's
I'd like to see that.
well, if the gate's open.
Um,
Now, the other way to do it is to hike it. Then you don't have to worry about the gate being open or closed.
It was open this morning. We drove
Yeah,
by.
generally during the week they keep it open for the nurserymen and the FedEx trucks and all manners of stuff.
So what's with the lone stump in the water? That old cypress tree or?
No, that's an old channel marker.
Oh, okay.
And they no longer maintain the channel on Queen Anne's Creek. There used to be a very major sawmill, and so they kept the channel open for the ships. But now this park straight ahead of us, well, one thing, you can't see very much of it, but there's a monument we just put up 5 years ago commemorating another one of our residents, Hugh Williamson. And Hugh and Samuel Johnston, they were both members of the First Continental Congress, very influential on standing up the new nation. And it also turned out that they were both the very first 2 elected senators from North Carolina. So you'll have to forgive me because I'll keep going back to it. A little bit of Edenton out in the middle of nowhere had a great deal of influence standing up the new nations because of guys like these 2. Hugh, he was involved with John Adams, and when they completed the draft of the federal constitution, it had to be ratified by all the colonies as accepted as the governing document. And Hugh signed it on behalf of North Carolina. So again, a lot of influence. The park itself, back in the 1990s, that was all abandoned commercial property, not very appealing. A developer came to Edenton with the intent of buying the property and putting up condominiums. Well, one of our local residents, Mrs. Moore, she got wind of that. She said that's not going to happen. She took an assumed name, and in secret, she bought the property out from underneath the developer, and then went to town hall and gave the property to town hall on 2 conditions. One, that it would always remain public space as we see it today. But number 2, her name was not to be associated with it. Apparently in a small town like this, she didn't want the notoriety of being this grand lady saving the waterfront. She just wanted to be Mrs. Moore, but she was not going to see condominiums destroy the waterfront here. Well, we kept our end of the bargain until she passed away at 94, 4 years ago, and then we immediately renamed the park Elizabeth Van Moore Park in her honor. Figure we're safe.
There you go.
But she was quite an elegant lady. If you get into you've been in the Welcome Center, you probably saw her portrait. It was a very elegant Southern lady.
Oh wait, what was her name again?
Van Moore,
First name?
Elizabeth.
Oh gosh, she was beautiful.
Is that the real
she's-
pretty lady?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Had the nice
Well, her
opera jacket.
families, they were multi-generational families here. Van, which I assumed was her middle name, that was her maiden name. And then Moore was her married name, and both of those families were long-term Edentonian and very influential on the town. She just carried on that tradition. Now, all these homes here along the waterfront, nothing really historic happened here, but I'll turn away from them. You can see them a little better. I like to point out the Queen Anne Victorian. That's a great reflection of that maritime influence. Even the architectural styles filtered down from up north and influenced the local builders. And as you go throughout Edenton exploring, you'll notice we're a hodgepodge of architectural styles, and it was all that outside influence. It's really not a house here that you can point to and say, oh, that's an Edentonian house. They're all influenced by these outside, well, the ship captains and whatnot. But that one, the Queen Anne here, that was built in 1899. Great reflection of that.
Talking about the yellow one?
Yeah, that's a Queen Anne.
You have to tell me.
Well, the Queen Anne is a northern architectural style, generally marked by the turret and all the gingerbread. The upstairs balconies off the bedrooms. Well, that's 1899. The two on each side, they're more of the Greek, Gothic style. And they were built 2 years later in 1901, and they reflect more of what the Southern gentleman thought his in-town home should look like. These wealthy merchants and all these plantation owners like to have an in-town home for their summer entertaining with the breezes coming in off the sound. But the fourth one to the right, again, nothing historic happened there, but that has been witness to all our history. A wealthy merchant built that back in 1775, so it predates the Revolution or the Declaration of Independence. But some friends of ours, Buddy and Judy, bought that 5 years ago. And of course, they invited all their friends over to show off the new house on closing day. I went in and it was nothing but shag carpeting and gaudy wallpaper and just a mess. And so they've spent the last 5 years kind of recapturing 1775. They've done a fabulous job. But Judy, like most ladies I've encountered, she made no compromise when it came to the bathrooms or the kitchen. They're all 21st century state of the art. Needless to say, she's not afraid to spend Buddy's money, so they are top shelf. He's done a wonderful job. But Buddy, the other thing about Buddy we enjoy, we just celebrated his 80th birthday with him, and he's been a book collector his entire life, and he's amassed quite an impressive library. And his fascination with books goes back to he put himself through Florida State University selling Bibles. And when you think about it, that's a lot of Bibles. But Buddy's funny. He'll sit up. You notice all the furniture on the porches? Well, like everywhere, porch sitting and weekend wind downs on the porches are Olympic sports here in Edenton. Buddy and Judy are quite accomplished. But he's funny because he's like a sheep in wolf's clothing. He'll sit on the front porch, and of course it's very easy for us to recognize our tourism guests walking up and down the street admiring the homes and whatnot. And he'll sit up there and he'll pretend to be very disgusted, and he'll say, "Well, where are you from?" Like one more. Well, if you answer him, picks up a glass of wine, and he said, "Well, why don't you come up on the porch, have a seat, and tell us all about your hometown?" So it's just a lot of fun from that perspective. But Buddy, being the book collector, he took the front room on this end with the fireplace, made that into his library, had bookshelves put on all four walls, and he'll be in there and he'll peek out and see who Judy's got on the porch, socializing with him. And if he's not interested in that particular group, he made one of the bookshelves. He just taps it and swings open. It's a hidden door and takes him right out to the back door, and he's into town before anybody knows he's gone. He's a brilliant man. But a lot of fun. Yeah, you'd video this.
If that's okay, I will.
But at great risk to himself and his fortune, Joseph was one of the 3 North Carolinians that signed the Declaration of Independence on behalf of the colony. So between Joe and Hugh over here, a great deal of influence on standing up the new nation with documents. But also he was a member also of that First Continental Congress, and George Washington appointed Joseph as our first Secretary of the Navy because of all that shipbuilding expertise. Well, living here, you notice you can't see much of the house, but back behind that grand oak tree, that's the old homestead from 1773. Another wealthy merchant, Mr. Collins, built that for his daughter and new son-in-law when they got married. Of course, I'm still waiting for my father-in-law to build me a house. I don't think that's going to happen. But because Joseph lived here in Edenton, John Paul Jones came here stayed with the Collins family in the homestead and met with his new boss, and Joseph gave Jones 5 ships. So that makes Edenton a very small but very real part of the cradle of our modern Navy as a result. So again, a lot of little things went on here, had a great deal of influence. Benjamin Franklin, he's responsible for the Edenton having cannons. He was also a member of that Continental Congress, and they put Benjamin in charge of a commission that was tasked with providing port protection for all the significant ports up and down the eastern seaboard. Well, Ben apparently thought highly enough of the importance of Edenton as a port of call, he made his list. And there were originally 28 of those cannons. Well, kind of a comical story. Benjamin promised the French so many bales of cotton, so many bales of tobacco in exchange for passing the cannons and hiring the Swiss to deliver them here. Well, the Swiss got the cannons here, and the local people said, wait a minute, we didn't make that deal. We're not giving you all our cotton and tobacco. And, well, the Swiss got mad, took the cannons up the creek over here and threw them over the side and said, in essence, there's your cannons. Well, they sat there for 65 years, and when the Civil War broke out, the locals felt better of it and went up and salvaged what they could and put them here where Ben had originally intended.
Are there any still in the
Yeah, there's quite a few. There were 28 originally, and I've counted roughly a dozen throughout town, all these old cannons. But,
Do you know what the big fish are that hang out near the bulkheads up here? Big.
well, they're likely they are catfish.
That's what I
That's what these guys are fishing for, catfish and perch. The guys you see in the boats, I haven't seen many of them today, but this whole area, they come from all over the country to fish this region for the largemouth bass.
Oh.
The Albemarle Sound is the largest freshwater sound in America. So,
They look like a bass.
Oh, they look like catfish. Is that,
Yeah,
you said
yeah, the
catfish?
catfish
There's
is
a whole
what,
school of them over there,
Yeah,
and
they were huge.
they were pretty big.
But now one other thing while we're still over here, I'm going to turn back towards it. But the brick building straight ahead of us behind Joseph's monument at the head of the green, that's the oldest courthouse in North Carolina. And it was built in 1767 and fully active right through the 1980s, and as such it's never needed to be restored. It's only been preserved. So when you go in, it is a state historic site. You see it just as Joseph and Hugh Williamson and Samuel Johnson saw it back in 1767. And it's such a classic example of undisturbed colonial architecture. When they built the colonial village up in Williamsburg, Virginia, they sent the architects here and used our courthouse as the model for the courthouse up in Williamsburg.
Oh, that's neat.
So yeah, it might look familiar from that perspective. The other thing, we're floating over a little bit of old England. This is where all the sailing ships would drop anchor and conduct their business with the town. Well, they would carry ballast stone for proper sailing weight of the ship to get here. But once they arrived, they threw all the ballast stone over the side in anticipation of all the crops and whatnot that they'd be taken back with them. Well, we don't have any natural stone in this region of North Carolina. And well, when they were building the courthouse, one of our town elders confronted the ship's captain and said, "Don't throw your stone over the side. We need it for the first floor of the courthouse." So now when you go in, you're walking on ballast stone that came from Nottingham, England.
That's
He
neat.
even kept track of where it came from.
That's cool.
Yeah, it's kind of neat. The other thing, we're looking at the front doors, and as you approach them, there are 2 layers of ballast stone steps leading up to the threshold. Well, over the centuries, they've become very worn from all the foot traffic. And so about 8 years ago, a couple of our local fellas thought, well, they're not very safe, so we're going to fix that. So they dug up all the stones to flip them over, put the flat side up. Well, they flipped the stones over to discover they were just as worn on the bottom as they were on the top. Somebody else had had that same great idea 100 years ago. And so, yeah. Now, the Welcome Center, you did get into the Welcome Center. Did you guys?
We did, yeah.
Well, that's Penelope Barker's house. Today it's a museum to her, and like I say, our Welcome Center. But her claim to fame, same year as the Boston Tea Party, Penelope organized in secret 51 of the lives of all these local politicians. And in support of their husband's struggle here with the King's representatives, they wrote a very nasty letter directly to King George protesting his taxation on tea by name, boycotting it, and all other English merchandise. It was a very, very brave treasonous act on the part of the ladies. And Penelope had understood that earlier that year the Bostonians had dressed as Native Americans to hide their identity from the king. That's how serious it was. Well, Penelope told the ladies they're going to know who we are. And at very great risk, they all boldly signed that letter and sent it off to London. Well, the other reason they did it in secret was, well, even though it was in their interest, the husbands wouldn't have tolerated it. In those days, if you were a lady and you had an opinion, you were encouraged to keep it to yourself. That was men's work. Well, obviously, Penelope didn't buy into that, and they sent their lover off to London, and very fortunate, that same attitude was prevalent in London when the letter arrived. And they saw it as a very comical situation where somehow apparently the poor men of Edenton had lost all control of the ladies and they'd taken over the town. And apparently that was punishment enough because they got away with their treason. But I've learned since living here in Edenton, there were actually 13 tea parties similar to Boston's for the same reasons and the same motivations. That taxation without representation. And so this is recognized as North Carolina's, the Edenton Tea Party, and that's why the town emblem is the teapot. And if you go up the street to the left of the courthouse, you'll notice in the backyard of the old homestead there's a Revolutionary period cannon with a bronze 150-pound teapot mounted on it, and it shows the Tea Party on one side of it. How that came about in 1901, a fellow brought his fiancée here to the plantation and they got married. And when he got back to Philadelphia, he had that teapot cast sent down here as a token of his appreciation for hosting the wedding. And he said in his letter, he said, I put the ladies of Edenton on the side of the teapot out of my admiration for their bravery. That's how significant this was. It's recognized today as the Edenton Tea Party, but it's also recognized as the very first female political movement in the United States.
That's neat.
So again, a lot of little things still influence us today. The other convention Penelope didn't adhere to was in those days when a lady married, she formally signed over all her property rights to the new husband. And the problem Penelope had with that was as if he passed away before she did without having children, she didn't get her property back. It went to his family. Well, she didn't sign any of that stuff. And as it turned out, she outlived 3 very, very wealthy husbands before the age of 35. And we don't think anything was in the tea, but it certainly.
I'm wondering.
Yeah,
I called her the Black Widow woman.
Yeah, so even her third husband only lived 7 years, or they were only married 7 years.
Well,
Something was in that teapot.
well, it certainly begs the question, what was that third guy thinking? Because he'd already buried 2. But here's what it was, in my estimation, this is how I surmise it. If you go into the parlor, you'll see that very attractive portrait of Penelope. She was quite an attractive lady. But just like all throughout history, there's always been these ladies who had a penchant for older, wealthy, successful men. Didn't want to wait around for...
Melania.
Well,
But her husband didn't look old. They have a portrait of them in there. Was he significantly older than her?
not to my knowledge,
Yeah,
but
he didn't
they
look
were
old.
married like 17 years, but he spent the majority of that time in England. He was an agent for the king. And
Oh, well, they said that she married him when she was 28. And you said by the age 35, she'd already married 3, so that means they were only married 7 years.
well, it's all who,
Okay.
it's all who tells
Storyteller,
Yeah.
fact.
Well, it's like I had a historian on here. All the railroads from the northern states came here to Edenton because in the early days to access the southern states with their goods, they had to get across the Albemarle here. And right over here, they built a railroad bed right out into the channel, and we had Mackey's Ferry here. And Mackey's had a 700-foot barge with railroad tracks right on the deck. And they could load up to 27 fully loaded freight cars onto that barge.
Wow.
Take it the 10 miles across to Mackey's terminal over by Plymouth, reverse the process. Well, what that did for Edenton, that placed us directly in the center of all the major railroad arteries moving our goods up and down the eastern seaboard. Well, that influenced the cotton mill to be built here, all the peanut factories, the sawmills, all manner of commerce came to Edenton because of access to the trains. Well, the result of that, and it kind of explains what you see as you go throughout Edenton today. In 1810, Edenton was listed by the federal government as having being in the top 10 most affluent towns in America at that time. And that's why you have all these Pembroke Hall up on the hill, Washington Hall, Beverly Hall's up there, out in the middle of nowhere. That was all this affluence. And of course they didn't have income tax in those days, so when these fellas made a buck, they got to keep it, and that's what they built. In fact, that's the son of Mr. Collins that built the house for his daughter and new son-in-law.
So who is Beverly Hall?
It's the name of the mansion.
Okay. 'Cause there's a big